Hello, and today we're going to be making this lovely Rick and Morty quilt. It is so warm. Just as a disclaimer, I'm not a seamstress of any kind. I don't exactly know how to sew. I know you might be asking, why am I doing a Rick and Morty blanket tutorial if I have no clue how to sew? My stuff is just kind of trial and error, and eventually it works out in the end. So we're gonna see how this goes, and let's get into it. So to start off, I am sketching out the portal and then cutting it. Of course, I didn't like the exact shape that I had sketched out, so I'm fixing it along the way. Of course, me, Miss Perfectionist. And then I'm going to be folding it once over itself and pinning it. I'm making little nicks with the scissors so that it can lay flat and it won't look wonky when I sew it. So I'm pinning it down and then pinning the rest of it. After I'm done with this, I'm taking it to the sewing machine. There's not much I can instruct you sewing machine wise, because I just kind of go for it and check myself along the way to make sure I'm not screwing anything up. But after I have it all sewn together, I'm going to lay down this tie-dyed green fleece, which is the reason why I wanted to make the blanket, because I thought it looked like the Rick and Morty portal. So there you go. I'm laying it down flat, pinning it to the black fabric, and then taking it to the sewing machine. Yet again, of course, checking myself along the way to make sure I didn't screw up, trimming the extra, and now it's time to move on to Rick and Morty. I traced out the portal itself. Now I'm sketching out Morty, then going to Rick, and fixing the little things I didn't like about it. Of course, I made their heads too small in the beginning, and then I made them a little bit bigger. And then after this, I'm going in with a black marker and solidifying the lines of the parts I want to keep. Then, once I have it all sketched out, all finalized, I'm going to be cutting out Rick, and then I'm cutting out Morty. So now I'm taking white fleece and I'm tracing out our shapes and making one whole base for Rick and then another base for Morty later on, and this way it'll just be easier to glue all the pieces together. And yes, I said glue, but you'll figure it out. Now I'm basically deconstructing a puzzle and putting it back together, cutting out the pieces that I need, and then placing them back on the felt finalized product, I guess you would call it. So I don't know if you can tell, but I'm taking the pieces that we have cut out of the pattern and taping it to the felt rather than tracing it out. That way, when I cut it out, it's the exact shape I want it to be, and I don't run the risk of marker bleeding through onto the final piece and just making it look super bad. I was so worried. So once I get the right side of his lab coat and hand done, I'm going to move on to the left side. And with the left side, I didn't have a big enough piece of white felt, and so I'm breaking into two and then hiding it with the collar of the lab coat. I don't know what you call that, but if you know what it is, please let me know, because I have no clue. Also, I didn't realize how much I moved the teeth around until I've seen this in high speed, and boy, oh boy, did he get his teeth rearranged. Now, I'm going in with E6000 glue. If you don't know what E6000 glue is, it's like a multi-purpose craft glue. You can use it on fabric, wood, anything and everything pretty much, and I'm just gluing everything down, starting from the top to the bottom. You know, the teeth, the mouth, the face, and then gluing it all to the base so that we have one solid piece. So once I'm done gluing Rick all together, I'm moving on to Morty, doing the same thing I did with Rick, where I create the white base, and then I go in with the felt, and I just start layering it. Also, I didn't know if you saw that, but that was 3 yards of brown felt. I looked everywhere for just a little piece of it. Nope, couldn't find it. So please tell me, what am I gonna do with 3 yards of brown felt? So once I get all of Morty put together and glued, then I'm trimming the base so it doesn't show through the final piece of our characters. Now I'm going in with embroidery string, or thread, whatever you want to call it, and I'm just hand stitching all the fine lines, the nose, the bags under his eyes, the little things that are lost because they're the same color, like the parts of the lab coat that I don't know the name of. Is it the collar? Please let me know. So once I get Rick all put together, I'm moving on to Morty, taking a marker, outlining the pupils, and taking a pencil and kind of drawing all the other stuff, like the line on his ear, his nose, his worry lines, if that's what you want to call it. And I'm just going through and hand stitching every single little thing. Didn't know how long hand stitching would take, but let me tell you, it's a really long time, like 2 hours. I wish it was only 5 seconds. But anyways, I'm placing them onto the blanket and I'm gluing them down with E6000 glue because I couldn't really pin them down with them being 2 to 3 layers of felt thick. So I'm gluing them down, that way they're in the place I want them to be when I plan to sew them together. So once they're set in place, I let them dry, and now I'm hand stitching their speech bubbles. And this one is obviously Morty's. It's gonna say, "Aw geez, Rick." And after realizing how long and tedious it took to film me just doing Morty's, I decided to do Rick's off camera. And it took me 3 tries to try and get his bubble the way I wanted it to be, but I guess, you know, 3rd time's the charm. So after I get done hand stitching all of it, I'm cutting it out, and as you can see, I'm moving on to Rick's, and then cutting his out as well. Then I'm actually sewing Rick and Morty onto the blanket. I'm using a test piece of fabric where I took 2 pieces of felt and a piece of fleece and just sewing it to see if it'll work out, and I didn't get any like kinks along the way. So now I'm just going in and actually sewing the whole part together and cutting the extra off and just making sure everything's all good to go. So once I get Rick and Morty sewn to the blanket, I'm going to be moving on to their speech bubbles, and I am just going to be pinning them onto the blanket itself and then sewing it together. I didn't glue it down because I didn't feel that it would be necessary, but to each their own. If you want to glue it down, if you decide to do this, then I encourage you to do so. So once I get the speech bubbles sewn down, it's time to move on to the rest of the blanket. I lay down the fleece and then the batting. I cut it out as evenly as I possibly can. Of course, there were some anomalies, but I'm gonna trim them as I go along anyways. So I'm pinning it all together because I don't trust myself to just try and freehand that all. Then I'm sewing the entire blanket together. So some people may like to do the step differently. They may like to pin the binding with the entire blanket and then just do it all in one go. But I personally like to sew the blanket all up first and then do the binding the very last. And of course, I'm lazy, so I'm just sewing it, putting the binding in place, sewing it some more, and doing it little by little that way, because it's the kind of person I am. So now, this is our finished blanket. I'm so happy with how it turned out. I know I say that all the time, but this is the first quilt of its kind that I've done. The only other quilt I did before this was a Levi quilt, so I'm happy with how it turned out. And it's at this point in the editing process that I realized I spelt quilt wrong. How? Freeze frame. We're gonna go fix this. I'm gonna grab the embroidery thread, I'm gonna grab the blanket, throw it on the table, and not spell quilt quit. Cause, oh my gosh. After I get the L in there, that's the end. That's the blanket. So I hope you enjoyed, And if you have any suggestions of what you want to see me do next, or what you want to see in the future, let me know. And of course, I'll see you in the next video.